Purchasers are always worried about staff. Do they take them on, and do they take on their past length of service? Who's paying what for who? So the next 3 questions deal with staff, and you might be surprised by the actual legal answers to some of these questions. So discuss amongst yourself, how do you present your existing staff with new contracts without getting sued? Okay, so
let Michael field this.
Rob mentioned you have to give staff notice before you present them with a new contract. How much notice?
1 year. It depends.
1 year.
It depends.
Okay, I've heard 2 years, 1 year, and it depends. I'm going to go with my favorite answer. It depends. Mike, explain, please.
Well, it depends on how long they've been with you.
In one case, a hygienist had worked part-time for 6 years for a dentist, and she decided not to go the route of complaining with the Labor Relations Board, and maximum she'd get is 6 weeks of her average pay, but she went to court. She sued under the common law for reasonable notice, and the judge gave her 6 months. So it's 1 month per year of service under the common law, and typically 1 week under the Employment Standards Act. It is capped in the sense that the Employment Standards Act caps, it maxes out at 8 weeks, and under the common law, it's roughly 2 years. First of all, employees, when they're let go, have a duty to mitigate by looking for another job. Okay, so if they haven't done a good enough job trying to get another job to mitigate their damages, courts will factor that in. Courts factor in how old they are, what position they had, were they integral to the company, how easy is it for them to find other employment. So they look at a whole bunch of factors. Okay, here's another tricky one. Dentists are selling the assets. Now, you know the difference between selling assets versus selling shares, right? If you own a professional corporation, you sell shares, or now in this situation, you're going to sell the assets of a dental practice. You can own those assets personally. Your professional corporation can own those assets. The idea is, if you're going to sell these assets, which one of the following are true concerning your staff? Under the Employment Standards Act, if a purchaser keeps your staff after the closing, will they always assume liability for that employee's past length of service? Or are they absolutely fresh new employees for that purchaser?
No.
Okay. So for the record, the Employment Standards Act, I didn't expect anybody to know this. It was a good attempt. It basically says any purchaser that keeps the staff from day one inherits all past length of service. There's one exception. What's the exception, David?
If there's a 13, if I'm correct, it's a 13-week period where they're not working for you from the date you take over to the date they come back. So if you essentially had them laid off for 13 weeks, you would sever that past accrued employment time.
So it's 8.
And 13 weeks is a lot. That's essentially 3 months.
Yeah.
Practically speaking, no one ever lays anyone off for 13 weeks because it kills a transition plan.
The Employment Standards Act is very narrow, and the liability is not that great. But when you look at common law and what happens in an asset sale where you acquire these staff and you keep them from day one, the liability could be huge. Like someone who's been there for 20 years, to get rid of them if you keep them could be huge on the purchaser. And we're going to talk about that right now. So what do you guys think about what happens to a purchaser who keeps an employee from day one after the sale, and whether their past length of service with the vendor would transfer over? Is that always going to be the case? What can they do to minimize or eliminate any kind of risks? Because this is the big thing. The purchaser, yeah. It's a complex area of law, right? But we're trying to give you the two contexts. The first context is the Employment Standards Act. Maximum exposure is 8 weeks. If you take over and keep that staff, your maximum exposure is 8 weeks, assuming they've been there for 8 years or more. Okay, you can't contract out of it. Can't do anything funny with contracts to get out of it. The only thing you can do, wait 13 weeks and then hire that same person, which nobody does because they need them as part of their transition plan. That's the Employment Standards Act. Now you guys know it down pat. Common law, judge-made law, this is the real exposure, right? Up to 2 years if they've been there for 20 plus years. Okay? So what can you do as a purchaser to eliminate that risk?
Ask the seller to take the risk.
Okay.
Then fire them and pay them.
Okay, and we discovered how often do sellers fire and pay out staff or give notice prior to the sale? Next to never. What about on the day of the sale?
You can do that.
Okay, now if it's a, what kind of market are we in?
Sellers market.
How many sellers would actually agree to pay out staff on the day of the sale?
No.
Nobody. So it's all on the purchaser most of the time. The purchaser only has a few options. Okay? Now I don't expect you guys to know this because it's a little complicated, but I'm just going to tell you the answer. Maybe I'll win a lottery ticket for myself. Here's how it works. In an asset sale, purchaser comes in and says, deal's done. Mr. or Mrs. Staff, I'm presenting you with a new contract. The contract says, I'm not recognizing any past length of service. Will you sign to stay with me? If they say yes, I got a brand new employee. Absolutely brand new. Common law doesn't have any bearing on it. Better yet, my contract's going to say, if I want to get rid of you, the most you can ever ask from me, 8 weeks under the Employment Standards Act, common law, you waive your rights. Now,
And that's legal?
that's perfectly legal. That's how you get around the
Sign
common law.
If
Now,
they
what if they don't sign it? If they don't sign it, can they go after the purchaser?
Or do they go after the seller? The seller.
So which is it?
They'll go after the seller.
Correct. The seller is on the hook because they had the relationship. They were supposed to pay out.